The WMD Lie and the Iraq War. The US pulled off one of the biggest propaganda campaigns of the 21st century with the whole weapons of mass destruction lie. The Bush administration went all in, using speeches, intelligence reports, and the media to push the idea that Saddam Hussein was hiding chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, a direct threat that supposedly had to be stopped. In 2003, Colin Powell stood before the United Nations, showing off satellite images and intercepted messages that were supposed to prove Iraq had WMDs. That evidence turned out to be completely false, but it was enough to justify the US invasion. Once Iraq was taken over, no WMDs were ever found. The war was based on manipulation and lies, but the propaganda didn't stop there. The US also sold the war as a mission to spread democracy and free Iraqis from Saddam's brutal rule. The media played along, pushing carefully crafted stories and images that made the invasion look like some kind of heroic rescue mission. Meanwhile, anyone who spoke out against the war was labeled unpatriotic or accused of supporting terrorism. The invasion was a disaster. Over 500,000 Iraqis were killed, most of them civilians, due to bombings, military raids, and chaos unleashed by the war. The US was also accused of looting Iraq's resources, from gold to oil. The war destabilized the entire region, leading to years of violence, insurgencies, and the rise of ISIS. Anti-Nazi. During World War II, the US launched a massive anti-Nazi propaganda campaign to rally Americans behind the war effort. Through posters, films, radio, newspapers, and even cartoons, the goal was simple: show Nazi Germany as a dangerous enemy and keep people motivated to support the war. Hollywood played a big role in this. The US government worked with filmmakers to produce movies like Why We Fight by Frank Capra, which explained the dangers of Nazism. Even big studios like Disney and Warner Brothers joined in. Donald Duck starred in the satirical short Der Führer's Face, which mocked Hitler and Nazi ideology. Propaganda posters often showed Hitler and the Nazi leadership as ruthless monsters, using slogans like "This is Nazi brutality" and "Stop this monster" to create a sense of urgency. Some campaigns also highlighted Nazi crimes, reinforcing the idea that this was a fight between good and evil. Another major theme was framing Nazism as the opposite of American values. The message was clear: American soldiers were fighting for freedom, while the Nazis represented oppression and dictatorship. This helped unite Americans and justified US involvement in the war. Anti-Communism. One of the biggest waves of anti-communist propaganda hit during the Red Scare, especially in the 1950s, thanks to Senator Joseph McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee. People were bombarded with warnings about communist spies, infiltrators, and traitors trying to take down the US from the inside. Movies like Red Nightmare showed what life would supposedly be like under Soviet rule. Basically, a total nightmare. Hollywood jumped on the bandwagon too. Science fiction flicks like Invasion of the Body Snatchers played on fears of communist infiltration, except instead of secret agents, it was aliens replacing normal people. Schools even got government-issued pamphlets teaching kids that communism meant no freedom, forced labor, and total government control. Religion became a big weapon in the propaganda war, with the US pushing the idea that communism was godless and evil, while America stood for Christian values. That's why "In God We Trust" got slapped onto US currency, and "Under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954 to make it clear that the US was on the good side, according to them. The space race and arms race also played into this, with constant messaging that the Soviets were out to dominate the world. This was used to justify massive military spending and US involvement in wars like Korea and Vietnam. The logic was simple: if communism wasn't stopped abroad, it would take over America next. Pro-democracy. During World War II, the US painted itself as the good guy fighting for democracy against the Axis powers, mainly Germany and Japan. There were posters and speeches that framed the war as a battle between freedom and tyranny. One big example was FDR's For Freedom speech in 1941. Then came the Cold War, and the messaging ramped up even more. The US really leaned into the idea of being a global champion of democracy, especially in contrast to the Soviet Union and communism. During the Korean and Vietnam Wars, US propaganda framed those conflicts as part of the bigger fight to stop communism and protect democratic values. Again, the US was shown as a helpful, freedom-loving force coming to the aid of countries under threat from authoritarian regimes. Anti-China. Over the years, the US has used different types of propaganda to frame China as a threat. Back during the Cold War, China was seen as a dangerous communist country, teaming up with the Soviet Union, supposedly working against US interests in Asia and beyond. That message got even louder during the Korean War, when American media made China look like the bad guy for backing North Korea against US and UN troops. Things cooled down a bit after Nixon visited China in the 1970s, but by the 80s and 90s, the anti-China vibe picked back up. When COVID-19 hit, anti-China rhetoric spiked hard. There were claims that the virus came from a lab in China, and that the Chinese government covered it up. On the military side, US propaganda often paints China's moves in places like the South China Sea as aggressive, warning that China's growing power could threaten allies like Taiwan, Japan, and the Philippines. Plus, the fact that China is friendly with countries like Russia, Iran, and North Korea gets used to frame it as part of an anti-democracy squad that's out to challenge the West. War on Terror. After the 9/11 attacks, the US kicked off the War on Terror. The government and media framed it all as a fight between good and evil, freedom versus terrorism. The US was cast as the defender of democracy, standing up for global safety. President George W. Bush made it clear with his famous line, "You're either with us, or you're with the terrorists." That kind of black and white thinking made the situation seem super simple, even though it really wasn't, and made war look like the only option. Another major theme was hero worship of American soldiers. Troops were portrayed as freedom fighters, putting their lives on the line to protect innocent people. Uncle Sam Wants You. One of the most famous American war propaganda posters is the Uncle Sam Wants You design, first created in World War I and later used in World War II. Designed by James Montgomery Flagg in 1917, the poster shows Uncle Sam, the personification of the US government, pointing straight at the viewer with the bold words, "I want you for US Army." The message was simple but powerful. Join the military. The direct gaze and pointing finger made it feel like Uncle Sam was personally calling out every young man, making them feel a sense of duty, patriotism, and responsibility. When World War II rolled around, the poster made a comeback, once again pushing for military recruitment. It became one of the most recognizable symbols of American patriotism and service, similar to Britain's Lord Kitchener Wants You poster. Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter is one of the most famous symbols of American wartime propaganda, representing the millions of women who stepped into the workforce during World War II. Was created in 1943 by artist J. Howard Miller for Westinghouse Electric. Originally, the poster was just meant to boost morale in factories, but it quickly became a symbol of female empowerment. With men off fighting the war, women took on jobs in factories, shipyards, and other industries, building everything from weapons to airplanes. The US government and companies used Rosie's image in posters, ads, and magazines to highlight women's contributions to the war effort. Even a popular song, Rosie the Riveter, helped spread the message that women were essential to victory.